Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome, to our ESG 101 Masterclass/webinar series, where we will be discussing ESG reporting, communicating environmental impact. Now, with that being said, just give me a moment to switch this off. Yes. Now, with that being said, ESG, or environmental, social, and governance, is a framework used by businesses and organizations to assess their impact on these three crucial pillars, which stand for environmental, social, and governance. And it goes beyond traditional financial metrics, providing a comprehensive approach to evaluating a company's contributions to the environment, its social responsibility, and the effectiveness of its governance structures. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Mark Patterson, a seasoned expert in ESG reporting. And during our time together, Mark will guide us through the intricacies of ESG reporting, focusing on how we can effectively communicate our environmental impact. Some key points we'll explore include the evolution of ESG reporting, importance of transparency, metrics and measurement, stakeholder engagement, and case studies and best practices. Mark Patterson is a founding partner at the Global ESG Monitor and a partner at Curry Communications, where they have played a pivotal role in shaping sustainable practices and driving initiatives that align with the principles of environmental, social, and governance responsibility. With a robust background in ESG reporting and communications, Mark Patterson has definitely become an authority in the field. So let's get ready for an enlightening session that will empower you and your organization to navigate the complexities of ESG reporting with a specific focus on communicating environmental impact. Without further ado, let's welcome our keynote speaker, Mark Patterson.
Hi, Randy. Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you. I'm joining you from Australia, just outside of Melbourne and in the eastern seaboard of Australia. And it's 7 p.m. tonight here, so a few hours ahead of you. It's great. I'm thrilled to be here. And if it's okay, Randy, what I might do is share my screen and we can jump right into it. How does that sound?
That sounds great.
Yeah, okay. And can you see that okay, Randy?
Yeah, I can see it perfectly.
Terrific, thank you. So yeah, I'm Mark Patterson. My company's called Curry, and we're in Australia, and we're thrilled to be a partner with Newmark in the Public Relations Global Network, an independent owner-operated international network of communications firms worldwide. So to Gilbert and the team, thank you very much for having me. Today we're talking ESG reporting, communicating environmental impact. In preparing today's presentation, I've made a few assumptions around what you might like to know. I've been very well directed by Newmark in terms of meeting a brief, but hopefully I won't answer all your questions, and some of the points that I raised today, I would love to hear from you in terms of your questions. I'm a practitioner. I don't know everything about ESG, but I've been working on ESG and sustainability reporting for 20 years. So I'll give you a bit of an insight as to what I know, and hopefully that's of interest to you. I think it's terrific, the timing of today's webinar, because we've just had 14 days of conference around COP28. Now, climate change is an existential threat to humanity, and there is no way to get to climate net zero by mid-century without looking after nature and the environment. And I'm not sure what you think, but I wonder whether we did make enough progress in the conference in Dubai the past 2 weeks, because fossil fuels are certainly a significant part of the challenge of managing the environmental impact of humankind. So the timing of today, talking about the E and ESG, yeah, it couldn't be better. So in terms of the webinar and my presentation, we're going to look at the E and ESG. Now, the E stands for environment, and it looks at how a company performs as a steward of the physical environment. What do I mean by that? I mean water, I mean weather and climate, I mean land and soil, I mean biodiversity and ecosystems, energy and air. And we're going to look at why we report on the E in terms of the environment and ESG, what we report on, how we might report on that. And then there's a few other ideas, insights and tips around what we've called what else for reporting E. So that's the agenda and the run through for the presentation today. Now, the E covers companies' utilisation of those natural sources, right? Their relationship with them and the effect of the company's operations on the environment, both in their direct operations and across their supply chains. And we call that upstream from your suppliers and input providers and transporters, and then into downstream in the value chain, supply chain, to your customers, to retailers, to consumers. So that's how we look at the scope, if you like, around the impact of a company's operations. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to talk about four things. And the first one is talking about why we report on the E. And I'm not going to talk at great length about this because hopefully you don't need too much convincing, but a little bit of context. I'm going to talk about dependencies, boundaries, and global risks very briefly. So this is, we're talking to the why. Now, believe it or not, over half the world's GDP, so something like US 44 trillion, is moderately or highly dependent on nature, actually the goods, the assets, the capital of nature itself, and the services that nature provides, like coastal protection or water filtration. There's a couple of examples of services provided by nature. Yet nature is in decline. And depending upon which estimates you're looking at, anything from 23 to 25% of land is now degraded, and there are large dead zones without productive biological life in our oceans. That is a real problem. But business and society are actually dependent on the health of the environment. And that's what we look at in ESG reporting. We're actually looking at what, if any, impacts, positive and negative, that a company is having on the health of the environment and its ability to contribute to progress, economic development, and society. Now, there's a number of diagrams in this presentation today, and I will share the presentation with Newmark and you. And in the notes pages, you'll see something like 50 reference points for the diagrams, for the figures. So as a resource, the notes pages in these slides hopefully will be of some value, pointing to all this reference material that I've been reading and collating over the last 10 years or so. So hopefully that's some value to you. So dependency, we can't have prosperity as society or business without a healthy environment. And that's what the E and ESG is all about, looking about the impact on companies of the environment and the impact on the environment from company operations. Now, there's a limit to how much the environment can contribute to society and business. There's this concept of planetary boundaries. There are 9 processes that regulate, if you like, the Earth's operating system. And of these 9 planetary boundaries, 6 have been crossed over. So what that's saying is that we're living beyond the Earth's limits. And some context, humanity is using nature 1.7 times faster than our planet's biological capacity to regenerate and sustain human activity. So that's the equivalent of 1.7 Earths. Now that amount of use, the amount of land, the amount of water, the amount of air, the amount of the environment that people need varies from continent to continent. In Africa, you don't need anywhere near as much of the environment to support your lifestyles and your businesses and your communities than they do in America, where because of the nature of consumption, if everyone on the planet used natural resources in the way that Americans do, we would need 5 planet Earths to support the global population and the global market economy. So we've got to look after it. We've got to do better. We've got to use it smarter. We've got to regenerate it because of those limits. Another reason why is the global risks. So each year, the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, has a report that comes out called the Global Risk Report. And you can see here, the green boxes are risks for the environment. The red boxes are around society, the purple boxes around technology, and the brown orange box there is around geopolitical risks. So global leaders each year are asked what they worry about. And you can see here that the top 4 risks over the next 10 years are all related to the environment. So it's another reason why businesses are standing up, taking a look and wanting to read and learn about the impact of companies on the environment. So the environment may give rise to what we call physical, transition, liability, and financial risks for a company. We'll get onto that a bit more in a moment. But people want to know that the environmental impacts and dependencies are for a company. Investors, suppliers, insurers, in the end, they want peace of mind that companies are managing these risks responsibly. And that's why we report the E in ESG. Now, those companies that neglect to consider the effects of their policies, their practices, their products on the environment may be exposed to high levels of risks. And those risks erode trust with stakeholders, and they actually destroy shareholder investor value. So that's why we've got to get on top of it. Now, as a case study, as an example, I work with the Australian dairy industry. And since 2013, it has been reporting its management of its risks. This page here is a page from the environmental section of its ESG report. So it actually has 4 pillars of sustainable development. One around livelihoods, which is enhancing economic resilience. One around people, consumers, and because dairy is a food, it's around improving nutrition. One around animals, about providing best care because they use animals to produce their food. And then the 4th commitment is to reducing the environmental impact. Now, the lengths that we go, like in terms of providing data, if you can see that, you'll see that this industry reports every year its progress against a range of goals and targets. So you can see there goal 8, goal 9, goal 10, and over the page is goal 11. And on this next page of goal 11, there's about half a page of footnotes to various references and data sources. And that's the type of that's the effort that you need to go to. That's the detail that you need to go to. So because that's what investors, people who are lending money to dairy farmers and dairy manufacturers, people who are buying their products, the cheese, the yogurt and milk out of their shops, they're looking for this information to see that dairy is continually improving, making progress against goals and targets for a more sustainable food production system. So as an example of an industry in Australia. That gives you some idea of the detail that's required in reporting to satisfy investors, customers, consumers. So we've actually been looking at why we're reporting on the E. That was number one. So we talked about dependencies, we talked about boundaries, and we talked about risks. Now I just thought it might be useful to touch on what you might report on environment. And this is really a top line race through that. So when we're reporting on the environment, we're reporting around greenhouse gas emissions. So carbon, methane, nitrous oxide production, those gases that are generated from the activity. Could be through energy use, transport, whatever. We're talking about waste, plastics, packaging, chemicals. We're talking about water, and we're reporting it around water use, water efficiency, water scarcity. So we're looking at those different dynamics, those domains of water. We're looking at biodiversity, both on land and below water, and we're looking at air as well. So they tend to be the aspects of E that we're looking at when we're reporting on E. So very briefly, just to jump into materiality. Materiality is like an assessment. That example I gave you with dairy before, with that table, they've got 11 goals, they've got 27 targets, and they've got 51 indicators and metrics supporting those targets and goals. It's a lot. And stakeholders say they want to know about those particular practices and outcomes around managing the welfare of animals, the amount of sugar that's going into food, how well workers are being looked after on farms and in factories. But the reality is you need to prioritise. So when dairy went out and did a materiality assessment in 2019, it had 52 topics to look at. So they had to prioritise those topics through a process called a materiality assessment to identify those topics which are highly material, the most important ones. And there's a 5-step process here in terms of assessing the most material topics. And these highly material, you'll have highly material, material, and important. They're your 3 levels. But the highly material topics are those that will substantively, significantly influence and impact the assessments, decisions, actions, and performance of an organisation. And that's what you're testing. It's a robust test that's designed to help companies know what issues are most material or relevant to their business and stakeholders, and know what information should be disclosed or reported in ESG reports. So an ESG report can be anything from 32 pages to 108 pages, depending on how many highly material topics that you report management of in your ESG report. So it's the process of prioritization is really important. Many of you might even know about this concept of double materiality, which is being introduced into Europe and how they're looking at doing materiality assessments. Now, this concept of double materiality actually acknowledges the fact that risks and opportunity can be material from both a financial and non-financial perspective. So now when they come to prioritise topics for ESG reports, they're not just putting that environmental and social and governance lens now over that assessment of those topics. They're actually using a financial materiality assessment as well. So businesses must consider 2 perspectives now in a materiality assessment. And one is what is material to them, the organisation, and what is material to society or the planet. And we're obviously focusing today on the E in ESG. So the upcoming European sustainability reporting standards will officially require double materiality as an assessment and reporting from thousands of EU companies, about 50,000 to start with in this coming year. But what that means is those companies will also be asking their own suppliers whether they are managing the environmental risks impacts responsibly as well. So the initial 50,000 companies are caught up in this legislative regulatory change in Europe, but ultimately anyone who's working with those companies in Europe is going to have to run this double materiality process over their sustainability, ESG topics. So we're looking at what you're reporting on. And we're talking about risks and impacts. So when writing ESG reports, we're going to look now at these 4 risks and the particular impacts. Now, physical risks is a first set of risks, and they can arise when an ecosystem, the balance of it is damaged. And this is an ecosystem like forests, for example, where the production of timber or minerals or whatever, or the services provided are used by a company in the manufacturing of its products. So the physical, think about air quality, climate, water security. So the risk here of the changing climate, which we all know about, extreme weather events, resource scarcity. Now, with each of these risks that you report on in an ESG report, you've got to talk about the impacts as well, how that affects the company, what the outcome of those impacts are, like lower asset values, increasing insurance claims. The cost of business is going to go up. So that's like physical risks. There's other risks which are called transition risks, which will appear in your report, talking about changes in policy, technological innovation, social change, trends, markets, consumers. So you'll get disruptions from that as we move to a low emissions economy or a nature positive economy. There's actually going to be some changes and transition, and that's going to have an impact on a company and ultimately affect shareholder value. So you have to be senior reporting on transition risks, for example. These risks tend to manifest themselves as regulation and policy, a technological change and disruption, or changes in consumer investment sentiment. So that's what we call transition risks. There's also liability risks and financial risks. So you've got a bit of an indication there of some of those risks. Now, liability risks have implications for businesses and directors of companies. Liability risks stem from the potential for litigation, where institutions and boards are deemed not to adequately consider or respond to the impacts of a change in the environment. Well, specifically, in this example I'm talking to now, climate change. Here in Australia and in New Zealand, it's now become mandatory to report, for companies to report on how they manage those risks arising. And if you don't, if shareholders or investors deem that you are not, as a director of the company, not managing that risk responsibly, they'll take you to court. Financial risks, you can see what a range of those are. They tend to be risk to financial institutions, and they come out in terms of, as you can see, credit, market, liquidity. Those financial risks emerge as a result of the liability transition and physical risk. So I'm wondering, I hope it doesn't sound too dense, too detailed. I won't go any deeper than that. But those risks and those impacts are the sort of things that you need to consider in reporting the E or the S or the G in a ESG report. That's what investors want to know. That's what the markets want to know. That's what insurance companies want to know. That's what the banks want to know. So just lastly, looking at what we're reporting on in terms of the E. Ultimately, with risks, you have dependencies. Here's why we rely on the environment. Here's the risks of the environment. Here are the impacts arising from these risks. And ultimately, there is an effect on the value of the environment through damage or regeneration. And work is happening now to come up with indicators and metrics that actually can be used to measure the value and change in the health of the environment. Through the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership in the UK, they talk about the value of natural capital, what they call stocks or assets or goods. Environmental stocks are that individual component of the environment, such as a mineral, land, timber, and water, which is a necessary part of whatever product or service is being made and distributed. So that's the actual individual animal, forest, or whatever. The other part of the value that they're trying to do in accounting for nature is around the value of the services provided from an ecosystem. Like a coral reef is an ecosystem. And from my work in East Africa through Zanzibar, I understand the value of coral reefs in terms of coastal protection from storm surges and things like that. So ecosystems, they're made up of a range of individual environmental assets, and that work together as a functional unit. But they provide services like water purification, for example, coastal protection that I mentioned, clean air, for example. So beyond dependencies, beyond risks, and beyond impacts, pretty soon we're going to be managing and reporting the impact on the value of the environment arising from our company's relationship with it, whether that's good or bad. So that's what we're actually reporting on in terms of the E in ESG. Now, in terms of how we would report on it, we'll look at some methodologies, standards, and stakeholders. And this is a very quick trip. Okay, in terms of methodologies, there are methodologies for setting targets. And as reporters, communicators, you might not be involved in doing that. But it's important to understand that methodology because you might actually have to report about it, how those targets were set. There's methodologies for measuring change in the environment. And then there's actually methodologies for reporting, how you report them. Now, these things, this took me a long time to understand, and I hope you find it useful. So these methodologies can be principles, they can be guidance and recommendations, they can be frameworks, they can be standards. They're all voluntary. And usually what happens when you're a method of accounting for greenhouse gases or a method for how you would report environmental risks, dependencies, impacts, and value, normally these things start as a principle, right? So and it's a frame, it's like a discussion document. That's the really low level. So a principle is just principles. This is how we think it should work. The next most important level is guidance and recommendations. So often you'll hear from an NGO or an organisation about providing guidance and recommendation for how you would report. Then you have frameworks. That's when it starts to get serious. Then you get standards, and they can be voluntary as well. So those things are guides to how you would report ESG. But when it becomes legislation in law, that's when it becomes mandatory. So in a sense, any type of methodology for target setting, measuring change, reporting environment, they start with principles, and sometimes it can take 10 years, and with a lot of consultation and buy-in, they become more important and more authoritative. But ultimately, some standards of reporting, of measuring, of target setting will become legislation in time, and you'll have to do them by law. So as an example of a methodology the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So if you wanted to know how to measure and manage your GHG emissions, carbon, methane, nitrous oxide, etc., you would use this standard. So it's not a principle, it's not a recommendation or a guideline, it's not a framework, it's actual standard. So it's considered really important by investors. So if you're working with companies, or you are a company looking to measure and manage your GHG emissions, this is the standard to use. It's the one taken most seriously by international reporting agencies and frameworks. So that's the GHG protocol, and you'll find links to all of these. It's published by the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for the Sustainable Development. It's actually also developed a set of calculation tools to assist companies to calculate those emissions. And if you are not a member of the United Nations Global Compact, become one. Join your local network chapter of that Global Compact, because you'll be able to participate in training courses in not only how to report ESG and report climate emissions management, but also in the methodology for measuring and managing them as well. Okay, standards and frameworks. I talked to principles, I talked to frameworks and guidelines. So here's a bit of an overview of frameworks and standards. Now, frameworks define an overall direction within a context. So you can see there the United Nations SDGs, top right hand. You can see TCFD as a framework on the right hand. So the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, they're frameworks. So they've been built up over time. And ultimately, the really good ones, like TCFD, they get adopted into standards, like the International Financial Reporting Standards has adopted that framework now as a standard, for example. So frameworks and standards usually are voluntary, but the standards are the most important ones. So that gets you a bit of an idea of some of the standards and frameworks. Now, standards themselves contain specific detailed criteria and methodologies that have been developed in the public interest, and they are able to be enforced by regulators and governments, right? So regulators are more likely to reference standards in schemes, programs, and laws than frameworks. So if you were looking at reporting, or you're looking at measuring and managing, look to standards if they are available. Now, one of the most important standards that reporters of ESG will be looking at are those from the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, and that's part of IFRS, that standard listed there on the left-hand side. They've got standards, they call them IFRS S1 and IFS. You know, it's really a soup of acronyms, ESG reporting. Try not to be put off by it. But the International Sustainability Standards Board and the Global Reporting Initiative are the two strongest set of standards to follow now when you are reporting ESG. And there are links included in the notes pages. Now, just here is another case study and example around greenhouse gas emissions. So if you want to measure scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, you go with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the GHG protocol. If you want to set a science-based target, you go to the science-based target. They're the people to deal with. That's the highest level of standard that you would want to go to. Or if you're working on a report, you'd be hoping that your client or your company is committed to setting a science-based target, or is in the process of doing it, or has done that. But if you only aspire or ambitious to actually want to claim to be carbon neutral, you go with climate active. But if you want to report how you're measuring greenhouse gas emissions, you'd follow the Global Reporting Initiative standard. So you can see there's different standards for different things in ESG. And lastly, on how we go about reporting E and ESG. This is my favourite because I come from a stakeholder engagement background. There's actually guidelines now. Well, actually, there is a standard now for how you engage and consult with stakeholders around what your material topics are. And very, very briefly, you can see there, those standards that come from the Global Reporting Initiative, you know, in your reports, like that dairy example I gave you, there's a whole section talking about how we decided who to consult with. And they used a stakeholder mapping tool from the accountability organisation, the AA 1000 standard for stakeholder engagement. You've got the link there. There's more in the notes. That tells you how to identify your stakeholders who you consult with. The GRI will tell you how to present them in segments, in tables, so you'll get direction on how to do that. You need to report what they want to know, what topics are of interest to them, and report how those topics change over time, how you engage with them. Are you doing it through communications only? Are you running events? Are you running workshops? Are you doing materiality assessment? Do you have competitions? Do you solve problems together in partnerships? And then what you're actually doing to address their interests. What we do in our stakeholder consultation, we involve our stakeholders, like in that dairy example, we involve them in decisions around what are the important practices and priorities in sustainable development. When we're looking for solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or reduce the amount of waste going to landfill, often we'll work with key stakeholders in the value chain to come up with new, exciting solutions that address their interests. And we report back to stakeholders saying, here's what we did with what you told us, and here's the progress that we're making. So that's how you go about ESG reporting. Now, lastly, just a few tips about the wrongs, insights, and greenwashing. So this is the what else. So the wrongs. These are mistakes more often than not made by first-time reporters. Failing to prioritise your ESG topics through materiality assessment, working with stakeholders, analysing the market, looking at laws and regulations. You need to prioritise them. You can't work on everything at the same time, so you need to work on the most highly material one. If you think data will be easy to get, think again. It's really hard, particularly the bigger the company. And things, what I mean by that is things that your stakeholders and your executive team say are really important things to measure and monitor and get data to show how you're looking at water utilisation. You might think the company already has that data, but 2 out of 3 times, in my experience, companies aren't consistently or reliably collating credible data that measures change or improvement over time. It's extraordinary. So that's one thing that don't make the mistake of not working hard on getting the data from people. You're going to rely on a lot of people across the organisation to help you with that. Please use a framework or a standard to structure your report, like the Global Reporting Initiative, because that makes sure you cover off all the essential elements of disclosure. Now, setting goals and targets is often hard for companies to do if they don't have confidence in baseline data or they don't have clear goals as an organisation. But by communicating goals and having them and communicating them, it actually does demonstrate that your company does care about the E in ESG. It's actually it's a notice of intent. And don't worry about whether they're achievable or not. That might be one of the things that a box that you look at, the practicality, the achievability, the credibility, the reliability. But actually having something to aim for is considered a must now in modern ESG reporting. And don't forget about your audience. Algorithms aren't your only readers of an ESG report online now. There are still humans looking for that ESG information. So I've got some links and tips there around keeping your ESG reporting sexy including strong pictures, diagrams that actually say something. So don't forget you've got an audience that you're communicating, not just an algorithm. Some insights from our reporting. Greenwashing will only get worse. We'll talk a little bit more about greenwashing in a moment. But one of the challenges, I don't know what it's like in East Africa and beyond, but ESG is growing so fast that we've got people coming from different fields of expertise. They might come from public relations or corporate affairs. They might come from chemical engineering. They might come from the chief financial officer area. But they all bring different levels of experience and expertise in ESG. So quite often, the story that are being told isn't being told reliably. One of the challenges we found is many people can now report why they're doing and managing and measuring their impacts and risks with the environment, but actually knowing how to do it better and get results is getting hard. So it's easy to set targets, but actually achieving them is pretty tough. So the capability, I think, is low. It's like a new science. It's like a new area of expertise. So if you're looking for ESG people to build your ESG function in your organization, you have to, so we have an annual report here in Australia that looks at remuneration of ESG and sustainability professionals. And from what I can tell, it's the fastest growing employment sector in professional services in terms of remuneration growth, because there are not enough ESG people going around. Yeah. And lastly, there, with not a high level of expertise and not 50 years of ESG reporting practice across the economy, reporting quality and the integrity of that reporting can be very inconsistent. So that's why with some partners in the Public Relations Global Network, Curry co-founded what's called the Global ESG Monitor, which is a measure of transparency of ESG disclosures in the world's biggest companies. So that might be something to have a look at. There's 180 data points that we look at in ESG reports to see whether they are actually providing full, complete, balanced disclosure. And when I say integrity and quality, and I'm almost finished, Gilbert, I'm talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly. Balance is a principle of reporting ESG. You can't just talk about the good things. That's when you start getting into greenwashing. Talking of greenwashing, here's a couple of interesting things. 40% of environmental claims online could actually be misleading to consumers. Interestingly, more than half of ESG reporters actually don't even report when they fail to achieve their targets. So they're not being transparent about that. And there's an example of a paper bottle which is actually made of plastic, and consumers online actually call that out. So you can't get away now in the digital age with not being honest and clear around the claims you make. And even in Australia and other jurisdictions now, we have corporate regulators fining companies who are not being truthful and honest with their claims. So in terms of the what else, here are 8 principles that you could use. They're not recommendations or guidelines. They're not frameworks or standards. They're just principles. It's a corporate regulator in Australia. And it's just an example. Here are 8 things that in ESG reporting you should take notice of. They're there to help businesses ensure that any environmental marketing and advertising claims they make about their products or services are clear and accurate and not misleading. So these types of tools and resources are now out there, and they're very helpful to ensure that that we don't cross over and don't present the truth in our reporting of ESG. And lastly, how transparent are you on the environment? ESG reporting is not always easy. It requires time and investment, capacity building, expertise, and resources to get it done right. So I've got a prediction. We started talking about COP28 and climate and how important that is to sustaining society and the prosperity of business. My prediction for 2020-24 is that climate reporting, as the climate reporting becomes mandatory for big companies in different countries around the world, your value chains, your business partners are going to start talking more about how you are managing, measuring, and reporting climate risk. So I think any company that doesn't have climate story crafted from the truth and based on data risks business-to-business suicide in 2024. I think a critical mass of business partners will think, you know, if they're not disclosing how they're managing their impacts on and with the environment, then how do I know that they have got my back when I come to report to my stakeholders that I'm doing the right thing by the environment? So Curry has a story around climate change and how we do manage it. And next year in 2024, we aim to be the first communications firm in Australia to set a science-based target for our GHGs emissions reduction. If that's okay with you, Gilbert, we'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was such an insightful presentation. It was quite interesting and intriguing to learn more about the importance of reporting effectively the impact that organizations have on the environment that they operate in. And just, you know, from the frameworks, the policies, and existing standards that organizations can use to reference in the development of their ESG frameworks, and really just the goals, including stakeholder engagement, which is so important, but often overlooked when these reports are developed by corporates, because all they're thinking about is the bottom line, but not necessarily the environment they operate in. So that was quite interesting. And we look forward to engaging you more once Gilbert is done. Now, without further ado, as we navigate the landscape of ESG reporting and delve into the intricacies of communicating environmental impact, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce a leader whose vision and guidance have been instrumental in steering our very own organization towards sustainable practices and corporate social responsibility. Our discussant today is not just the CEO of the Newmark IMC Group Limited, but a passionate advocate for the integration of ESG principles into the core fabric of our business strategies. Under his leadership, our organization has not only embraced the importance of environmental, social, and governance responsibility, but has also become a beacon for others seeking to align profit with purpose. With a deep understanding of the challenges and opportunities presented by ESG reporting, our esteemed discussant has spearheaded initiatives that reflect our commitment to transparency, accountability, and positive impact. In today's discussion, Gilbert Manirakiza will share invaluable perspectives on the journey our organization has undertaken, the lessons learned, and the role of leadership in driving meaningful change. Their insights will undoubtedly provide a unique lens through which we can understand the practical application of ESG principles within a dynamic business environment. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to our CEO, Gilbert Manirakiza.
Thank you. Thank you, Randy. And I truly appreciate your kind introduction. I also want to really say that I'm very impressed and truly educated by you, Mark, because that presentation is, in my view, something that should be presented at all the world summits around climate. Why do I say that? It's because, to be honest with you, I feel like there are a lot of global conversations, and those are great, and those negotiations are good. We've just come out of COP28, and I would like us to discuss that shortly. But I feel that ultimately, these problems we're talking about are global in nature, yes, but action is local. And when you go local, and when you go into communities and countries and societies, businesses are actually playing the critical role. They're the ones that are directing the efforts of governments to generate more revenue. If you want more revenue as a country, as an economy, you need to have vibrant businesses, and you need to have businesses that produce products and services that people want to consume. And it so happens that the practices of many businesses are unfortunately also hurting the planet we live on. However, if we were to transform that relationship between the company and the earth, and at the same time we change how people consume and how companies produce, I think we could get to a place where the relationship is no longer an adverse relationship, where our own consumption as consumers is negative for the planet, but it's actually positive. So everything you presented really educated me and helped me to see how even ourselves at Newmark can do things better. But I'm looking forward to working further with you to make sure that all our clients and all the entities that we interact with are educated in the same manner, because clearly we have a framework that has come of age. And it's very evident to me from what you presented that reporting is really key, because anyone can claim anything. Anyone can take a microphone and say we are doing great things. But if there is no framework to check what they're saying that they're doing, then anyone can truly say anything. So I don't want to attempt to go into the details of what you presented in terms of discussing the specifics, because I believe it should be consumed as you presented it. What I want to try and do is to sort of raise a few questions that every single company leader that will watch this, that is attending, should be looking at in order to navigate this particular topic of ESG reporting, focusing on the E, which is reporting on environmental impact and interventions, so to speak. So I want to as you were talking, I was quickly typing down how my mind was processing what you were saying. Essentially, I do that because most of the times I find myself in boardrooms, C-suite situations where I'm talking to leaders, talking to CEOs, talking to boards of directors, and trying to help them navigate how to bring the brand into these conversations. So I would like to share some of the questions I typically will see myself sharing with these ecosystems, so that they can start actually on that journey of getting to what you have presented. So I'm going to project my screen. I chose a very simplistic approach to tackling these questions, or to at least to raising the questions, because I believe that your presentation actually answers the questions themselves. So the idea is not necessarily to tackle your presentation because I just think it's comprehensive enough, but I just want to raise some of the brand related questions that I believe every CEO who is either attending or who is going to be watching this session at their own leisure is going to be considering, so that they start on the journey effectively and sustainably. So I would like to, first of all, put us into context. You started by talking about COP28, and I just wanted to highlight some of the key recent conversations that are very loud, or that were quite loud at COP28, so that we start also making sure that we are tied into these global conversations. As I said, the conversations are global, but the actions are local. But it's always good to know what's happening globally, so that even companies can start having the same language. And we'll see why I would like that to be the case. At COP28, one of the big topics was the global stock take. Some of the people might not know what this is, but essentially, this was a mechanism put in place to assess how the world is collectively progressing towards achieving the goals that are enshrined in the Paris Agreement, which is essentially today the world's framework when it pertains to the global climate action process. So I would encourage everyone to try and learn more about the GST or the global stocktake so that you can also be able to incorporate that into your language and into your thinking. The second thing would be the impacts themselves. There has always been the focus on climate change impacts, and that didn't change. This was also a key focus, and particularly since we're speaking from an African context, African countries have been very emphatic about the focus on the impacts because Africa is the continent that is increasingly more and more disproportionately impacted when it's actually accounting for very minimal emissions and causes of the impacts compared to the rest of the world. So there are conversations around funding adaptation in Africa. There are conversations around aspects of mitigating the causes of the impacts, but for Africa, definitely the adaptation conversation is big. And you'll hear a lot more about things like the loss and damage fund, which is very important for African countries and regions. Then there was a huge conversation and debate around fossil fuel phase out and carbon capture and storage technologies, fossil fuel being the main source of energy for key sectors around the world, especially transportation, but also many other sectors. Obviously, many of our economies are still heavily dependent on the use and the burning of fossil fuels and other fossil type fuels such as coal and so forth. So this is a big topic. This is a big emotive issue, not just in those negotiations, but increasingly, like you said, Mark, a lot of countries are starting to put in place measures, standards, regulations to drive the reduction in the use of fossil fuel. We know that Europe already has a timeline in terms of when they will have phased out, for example, fossil fuel powered vehicles. And I believe that many countries will follow suit. In Africa, we might not see such an aggressive approach because our economies are still trying to grow, and many countries believe that that Africa has a right to also grow and develop before we start being asked to comply with some of these measures. However, many companies on the continent may need to start thinking about, the double win. We can still develop while we have clean, green, sustainable development at the same time, which means that we may have to think about how we want to steer our development and leapfrog the polluting development model that we've had and instead go into a green development ecosystem. Those are conversations that I would highly encourage anyone from any company here or even future professionals to look into deeply so that you may contribute to the solution when it comes to those discussions. Food systems is extremely significant for Africa as a topic. I would say that it probably didn't get as much prominence at COP28 as it deserves in terms of the various thematic areas that ended up carrying a lot of bandwidth within the negotiations and discussions. The fossil fuel discussion took a lot of attention. And I would personally hope that food systems and food security and sustainable food production could become more of a topic in the future, simply because climate change is having a very significant impact. And this is, according to science, is having a significant impact on African food systems. So I would like now to just shift to the questions that I mentioned earlier. As I said, I don't necessarily want to repeat what you said, Mark, because I'm just really mind blown by how rich and how advanced the frameworks are. And I believe that Africa is probably going to learn a lot from Australia and many other developed regions in this particular area of ESG reporting, especially when it comes to reporting on environmental action, interventions, and impact. I, however, would like to inspire some questions for leaders in Africa to start incorporating into their C-suite conversations, perhaps as they start looking at this. And these will mirror some of the components that you raised. And in fact, I would say that a lot of the answers to the questions will start with what you presented, Mark, but the meat of it, the actual content of it, will have to come from the companies themselves. Now, one of the things that I believe when it comes to the brand itself, and I would like to focus on the brand, is that the brand will have to start from a place of defining its purpose. So if you are leading, working for a brand, and you are called upon to define what the ESG reporting framework should be, I believe that the first place to start should be the purpose of the brand. And to some extent, in the context of ESG, the purpose may actually have to be different from the purpose that you had before. Because for some companies, maybe the purpose is to be the best manufacturer of tires or the best real estate development company out there. But I think that in the context of ESG, the question might have to be different. It might have to be, what should society and humanity think about your existence as an entity? Why should they care about you? What is the ultimate goal for the existence of your brand? Mark, I have so many conversations with CEOs, boards of directors, and I ask them this question, and you'll be surprised. If I have 5 people in the room, I'll get 5 different answers to that question. So it's very important for there to be consistency on that particular question. The second question would be, how does that particular purpose interact with ESG dimensions? That is the environmental responsibility and also the social and governance dimensions of the business. What values does the organization actually embody as an organization? And also, what is the brand equity goal? I often find that many organizations don't think about the importance of the equity of their brand when it comes to ESG. They think that ESG is this regulatory thing that we have to do, everyone is doing it, so let's just do it. My own recommendation is to look at the ESG conversation in the context of the value of the brand. What is the perception that consumers or stakeholders are going to have of the brand vis-a-vis the quality, the desirability, and the loyalty of the brand based on your ESG interventions? So I highly, highly recommend thinking deeply about the type of equity, because if one doesn't want to build their brand's equity, if they don't want to enhance the quality, desirability, and loyalty of their company's brand, which would be strange, but if a company is not interested in that, then to be honest with you, probably they wouldn't be interested in ESG. But the opposite is also true, that any company, any organization that cares about these 3 dimensions will and should prioritize ESG and the reporting related to it. And the second dimension would be around people, the people involved in this particular, or the people dimension when it comes to reporting around environmental issues. Now, Mark, you have taken some time to talk about the interactions that should take place between brands and stakeholders. And I completely agree with you. I think that brands should take great care to be part of global and local conversations. And that is why I wanted to start with that reflection on what happened at COP28. Obviously, that was a gross summarization of what happened. But I just wanted to highlight the fact that some of those global conversations are very important, but they're not only global conversations. They translate into local impacts and local discussions and local challenges. If you have in Kenya, for example, recently we've been having floods across different regions, and these floods have been the worst that the country has ever had. There have been floods in the past, but they're getting increasingly worse, and scientists are saying that this is because of climate change. So, and that's a local conversation. which finds its place in global conversation. So if a company is based in the Kenyan context and they get to have access to the science behind these local conversations, they then have an opportunity and the authority to be part of those conversations, and where possible, to even be a solution for that context. So I think this is very important to think about, to have those conversations, not just because sometimes conversations are not necessarily about doing something, but it's also just being part of the context that the company is evolving in terms of talking to the people affected, or those people who can influence different activities. And that also leads me to the second question, which is, as a company, as an organization, how do your actions affect or influence what is happening around you? And you talked at length about this, Mark, and I believe that people will be able to review your content. So I won't go into too much details commenting on some of these questions, but I'll just run through them. Obviously, who do you need to achieve your purpose? This is something that is very important to reflect on when going into that planning process. Who do you need to help in order for them to achieve their own climate goals? Because sometimes it's not just about a company and what it can do. Sometimes it might look around itself and say, I want community X to be able to achieve their own goals, and therefore I want to partner with them. But also, and this is something you covered greatly, Mark, what do your investors and customers care about? These are very important questions from a brand perspective. The answers you come up with for these questions are ultimately going to feed significantly into your own approaches and efforts. And perhaps I should have added here something that you significantly highlighted, Mark, which is, what are the regulations in terms of public stakeholders or government stakeholders? What regulations are they putting in place? What is their own outlook? What are their plans and desires and strategies for the future? And are you aligned with that? Perhaps in Africa, there is a bit of a nuance in the sense that many governments have simply not yet prioritized a lot of the regulations we have seen in Europe and in Australia and in North America. We may start seeing this going forward, but I don't necessarily anticipate that this will be the case. If I were to be recommending to companies on the continent, I would be telling them to not necessarily wait for these regulations to come for them to be a force of good as companies. They should actually be ahead of the curve, and they can inspire their own governments to do the right thing based on their own reporting and based on the interventions they are putting in place. And they could actually work with governments, because sometimes private sector can actually have more insight in terms of what can be done, and then give that insight to their governments. I would like then to go to the third P. I'm actually, as you have seen, I'm dealing with different Ps. I started with purpose. The second one was people, and the third one is product. And what I heard you say, Mark, is that essentially companies should be also trying to find out what is the data, just to begin with. That was a key point that I took down. What is the data saying on the sector and products' impact on the environment and climate? And one of the last points that you said that I myself took note of is that the data, we may take for granted the fact that data is not easy to come by, because we don't always collect this data systematically. So this is something that I think many of the executives watching or taking part should ask themselves, and then try to find the right answers, and also, if possible, try to put in place the right systems. What trade-offs? This is also something else. I think globally we talk about the various trade-offs that countries have to make in terms of fast development vis-a-vis sustainable development. And also companies, especially in the Gulf states, are really grappling with the trade-off of a quick transition to a non-fossil fuel economy, vis-a-vis the fact that they need to continue running their economies using the incomes coming from fossil fuels. So there are always trade-offs when it comes to these transition conversations. So what are the trade-offs that your company or organization has to contend with in order to reduce these adverse impacts? And also, not be seen as greenwashing. What consumption patterns, and this is an important one, companies may have to start educating their clients on a different type of consumption approach. Recently, I listened to an interview on Fox featuring former US President Donald Trump, where he talked about the fact that many Americans simply don't want to buy and drive electric vehicles. And I found that puzzling, because you would assume that everyone wants this wonderful new technology that will save the planet. This is not always the case. Sometimes consumption patterns are entrenched, and it may require helping consumers to transition to the new type of consumption. And the question a company, in my view, could ask themselves is, what role do I have to play in positioning, and how should I position myself as a brand to not just transition, but also benefit from the transition? Because it's not fair also to ask of companies to drive themselves into the ground just because they have to transition to a new technology. So I think this is an important question. The last one on this particular pillar under product that I put down was, how can a company or can an organization promote a sustainable product life cycle? And I like one characteristic you put down, or you mentioned, Mark, which is science-based life cycle. And I would move on now to the final dimension, which is process. Essentially, and I believe this is a good summary of what you mentioned in your presentation, which was quite extensive, and I'm not sure I'm doing justice to it, but I looked at some of the wrongs you put into your last slide, or towards the end of your presentation. You talked about some of the wrongs that many companies are guilty of. And it was exciting, because I thought that that is also a good place for companies to start the conversation internally, whether at board level or at C-suite level. Is ESG a priority for them? When I talked about purpose, I mentioned the questions they need to ask themselves when it comes to the importance of ESG. But I think when it comes to process, then a process needs to be put in place to prioritize this, because it's also not just a brand issue here. It may have to be an entire process issue, a structural issue. Do they have the right people? Do they have the right systems? Do they have the right culture to prioritize ESG? And if that is not in place, then that particular management team may have to start thinking about how to change that particular situation. Data collection, you mentioned, is a big problematic issue, and I think that data collection has to be systematized, simply because the data may require new systems, new technologies, and even data collection experts to come in and design the right data frameworks. Framework of reporting, I won't belabor that, because you talked about that quite significantly. Goals, what are the objectives to be achieved? Audience engagement, I was very thrilled when you mentioned that, because I feel that sometimes companies are very excited about releasing a report. They will probably do some announcement of some sort, but this engagement is probably limited to that particular point in time when this report is coming out. And this is lost along the way. There's no consistency, there's no continuous engagement and collaboration with the various stakeholders and audiences that who can give them very valuable feedback. And I think that this is something that would be very helpful. Lastly, companies, particularly in Africa, in my view, are not at a point where they can afford to just wing this or do this by themselves. I think that getting the right expert would be a fantastic approach and entry point. Something like this would require getting it right from the get-go. And one of the things you said that you will do at Curie by implementing science-based measures within your company is definitely something I'll take a cue from you on. I will probably also engage you on that so that we can follow in your footsteps, because you are strong experts in this particular field, and I believe that many of us can benefit from doing this the right way, simply because it costs too much time, and and I believe that many organizations would simply be better advised to get it right from the get-go, so that they don't find themselves being accused of greenwashing or implementing measures that are simply not having enough impact, however well-intentioned they may be. Thank you very much. I hope I haven't taken too much time. I'm going to stop there. We can perhaps have a couple of questions. Back to you, Randy, and thank you everyone for your attention.
Thank you so much, Gilbert. That was such an insightful discussion, especially the point where you touched on the importance of branding as well. With that being said, we're going to get into our Q&A session. I see we have quite a few questions in the chat, so I'm not sure how many Mark and Gilbert will be able to take, as we do have limited time left. So I'll just randomly pick 3 questions and direct them relevantly. So the first question is from Jeffrey Okundi, and his question is, companies in Africa face several hurdles in communicating environmental reporting. These include limited awareness and understanding of sustainability practices, insufficient regulatory frameworks, inadequate access to reliable data, and challenges in implementing standardized reporting methodologies. Additionally, economic constraints, lack of resources, and varying levels of commitment to environmental sustainability across different industries contribute to the complexities. The question is, how do we manage these hurdles to ensure effective communication? How do we also involve researchers in moving forward? I'll direct this one to Mark, if you could answer that question.
Sure, Randy, thank you. And hi, Jeffrey, thank you for your question. So in my work with communities and governments in the Philippines and Indonesia, in what us Westerners might describe as a low resource setting, sustainability, or ESG, to those people in those communities, governments and businesses, is really survival from 1 week or 1 month to the next, right? So my answer to you and to them is to start small and start by reporting commitments and plans, and roadmaps or pathways, what your intents are, what you're going to work on, and why you're going to work on it. I mean, the first sustainability report or ESG report or communication or brochure or webinar can actually not be that ambitious. So, and I think the more people you involve in those communications, those activities, those workshops, those discussions, including scientists. I've been working with scientists and communicating their work for 25 years. If they're involved in those discussions, those meetings, what we find is that they often have resources that you as a practitioner or as a business don't have. And by pulling together scientists, buyers, suppliers, and other stakeholders, NGOs, around areas of common interest in the environment, and it might only be greenhouse gas emissions, or it could be just waste to start with. But if you pull those people together in a conversation, I'm sure you can produce communications and videos, a website that actually talks to environmental communication and gets you at least over the first hurdle. Don't be afraid of taking small steps at the start.
Wow.
All right. So I'm going to link that question with the following one, Mark. I think it relates because he also asked about, involving researchers moving forward whilst in compiling ESG reports and the like. So when it comes to ESG reporting, how crucial is it for companies to integrate qualitative narratives alongside quantitative data? What are the benefits and challenges of incorporating storytelling into these reports? So I think, Mark, you can tackle the first half of the question and Gilbert will take on the second one, because I think it pertains to, you know, organizational branding as well, and meshing that into the statistics and, you know, all the nitty-gritty in reporting environmental aspects and impact.
Sure, Andy. So when brands talk to emotional, rational, and functional benefits, right, Gilbert? And to your question around incorporating storytelling narratives, we do it all the time, because the quantitative data, you cannot manage what you don't measure. So you need that quantitative data. But if you want to touch people's hearts, get into their souls, you actually need to have stories about people and what changes the management of those risks, impacts, the partnerships the work has done, how that's made a difference to the lives of those people, the prosperity of the businesses, and the health of the environment around them. So we always strike a balance. And in an ESG report, I suspect a third of it is storytelling narrative. A third of it is the contextual, talking about what happened, why it happened, and how it happened. And a third of it is the quantitative data, the metrics and the indicators. That's the sort of way I would approach it.
Yeah.
Gilbert, I don't know if you have
Yes.
anything to add on to that.
Fantastic question, and thank you, Mark, for those insights. So one of the biggest challenges I've actually had with the current climate action initiatives that you see across the continent and globally is that I actually feel like they make very little effort to actually do exactly what Mark is saying, which is break down the science and the complexity to bring it to the reach of you and I, who are just going about our daily lives. So, you know, Secretary General of the UN can make a big speech at COP28, but I'm on my TikTok watching a cat video. So, you know, it might be great what he's saying and it could save the planet, but I'm the one whose consumption patterns will actually change something. So talking to me is actually much more impactful in some ways. Obviously, the regulations could help, yes, but convincing me that I probably should not, you know, use certain products because they pollute the environment would probably have much more impact. So to your point, reaching me makes sense. So how do you do that? You get me on where I am, which is through the storytelling that we are talking about. I might be interested in cat videos. I might be interested in the stories that are happening around my community. So is there anyone who looks like me who's talking about this issue? It would be very powerful, therefore, for companies to not just use their advertising dollars or shillings or whatever currency it is to just promote their products, but also to use the same energy, the same focus, the same drive to actually communicate around these ESG issues. You know, a story is simply when someone, think about the stories you heard when growing up. You had, say, Cinderella. You had the evil witch. You had Cinderella, who was the nice young lady who was mistreated, and later on she had a very happy ending. That's a classic story that interests all of us. Why? Because we can relate to Cinderella in our everyday lives, and we want her to win. How can you make me want the planet to win by using storytelling in the same manner? It's not that complicated, but companies consistently use methods that are not adapted to connecting with people. And what Mark said is very, very true. We need to change that. It's not complicated. It's not rocket science. We just need to realize that just having a CEO going on a podium to launch an ESG report is not enough communication. It's not enough. You need the stories. You need to use the pop culture. You need to use the influencers. You need to use the cats on TikTok if you can. But we have to do this. And I think that we can help brands do it because, yes, brands are not built to do it. But to answer the question, it's very critical. It can be done. And it's not, we don't have to look very far to do it. The companies communicate using storytelling very well, but only when they're promoting themselves. How about now they switch some of the dollars to promoting a healthier climate, and you will see a lot of things changing. I hope that addresses the question.
I believe it does, and I hope Jeffrey's answered. And in the interest of time, this will be the last question that I ask. And I think I'll be directing it to Mark. Let's see. How can businesses strike a balance between disclosing comprehensive ESG metrics and avoiding greenwashing, ensuring their reported achievements authentically reflect their environmental efforts? And how can stakeholders and potential investors safeguard against this?
Yeah, great question again. Thanks, Randy. I think that if you used an analytical tool like the Global ESG Monitor, or you looked at the Global Reporting Initiative Index, which is like a table with many criteria that you need to address in your disclosures, right? You need to tick those boxes. So if you use the Global Reporting Initiative Disclosure Index, or you use the Global ESG Monitor tool for a guide to transparency around completeness, balance, transparency, etc. If you use tools like that, then I think that'll help you find that whether you've got the right balance or not in between comprehensive metrics of ESG and fluffy greenwashing. That'd be my advice there. It will get easier in time as the indicators and metrics for the environment and even social impacts and values, capitals, as they become tested and proven, used. Yeah, I might leave it there. Very good question. Thanks, Randy.
Thank you. Gilbert, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add before we wrap up.
No, but actually, I think you can sneak in one last question. Since we have Mark, if you have one good question, I think we can take it before we close.
Okay, so the last question, in the realm of ESG reporting, how do you suggest addressing the issue of data reliability and accuracy, especially for companies operating across different regions with varying reporting standards?
You've made the hardest question the last question. One of the things we found is that, great question. One of the things we found is that when we're working with global frameworks in an industry or a company, the indicators and the data, the metrics that work in North America don't work in Australia or in Southeast Asia. It is a real challenge. So what we've tended to do now is we're starting to communicate the indicators and data that are relevant to those different markets and the nature of the operations on a region-by-region basis. I think they've got more relevance to stakeholders in those regional markets. Having said that, we use some criteria for identifying indicators and data sources, which enable you, and it's a bit like a materiality assessment and prioritizing ESG topics. You do an analysis of those data sources, looking at their credibility, their reliability, for example, the integrity of them, and you make an informed calculation as to whether to pick those data sources. I'll be very quick, but last week we published an ESG report, and we only had data for half the targets and indicators in the tables because it didn't make sense to monitor, measure and report data every year across the whole spectrum of practices, products, and outcomes. So there will be gaps in data from time. Sometimes you can't even measure change in 1 year, right? It has to be 3 years. I'm not sure. Hopefully that helps you a little bit. It is a challenge. You just have to be very choosy about which metrics and data sources you go with.
Yeah, and if I can just add one last point, when it comes to ESG, generally speaking, one doesn't have to do everything at the same time. It's possible to move in bits and pieces. You start with what you have. Maybe you could even start reporting on the region that you do have, the fullest extent or the most extent, in terms of data. And then once you get to a place where you can activate another market or another region, you do so. The critical thing is that credibility dimension is very important, because the problem is if you, for example, get it wrong and you find yourself dealing with accusations of greenwashing in one place with the speed at which information travels, it will be very hard for you to catch up and for you to reverse that perception. So my strong recommendation would be to start with, even if it's a pilot program, I'm not a big fan of this, but if you start with what you can credibly communicate and report on and implement, then you can have starting point and a good foundation for more credible engagements into the future. I think companies should not necessarily feel the pressure to have a big bang in terms of ESG reporting. I think starting in pieces might actually be the best approach. And I think that's what Mark was saying that they've done with those other clients they've worked with.
Thank you so much. So that brings us to the end of our very insightful and informational ESG 101, Communicating Environmental Impact Effectively webinar. And once more, Mark, we are so honored and so happy that you could be a part of this. And really just for the information that you were able to share with us, because I'm pretty sure a lot of the attendees, myself included, did not know how much goes into ESG reporting, especially just the E already. So I can only imagine a complete report and what a gargantuan task that must be for organizations. So it's very important that they get it right, and not just for the bottom line, but really for stakeholders and the immediate environment that these organizations operate in. So we appreciate that. To the big boss, our CEO, Gilbert, thank you as well for taking the time to be a discussant. And I see we do still have more questions. Unfortunately, due to time, we will not be able to answer them here, but they will be answered on our website and the relevant social media platforms. And yes, I think that brings it to a close. If you're looking for Newmark on social media and otherwise, just look up Newmark-IMC Group Limited, and you will find us, LinkedIn and otherwise. Thank you so much. And I hope you guys learned as much as I did from the Newmark Group, myself, Maranda Nishfrani. It's been an amazing and informational webinar. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Randy.
Bye.
Bye, Mark.